Hey everybody, and welcome to Epic Everyday, our weekday podcast for busy, stressed out Christians who want to do more than just survive. I'm Liz Fergs, and this is my husband Evan.
Good morning.
And we're so glad you guys are here with us on this wonderful Tuesday.
Yes, thank you for spending part of your day with us. If this episode is interesting to you or thought-provoking, or you think somebody else might benefit from it, please share it with them.
Because we believe the more people who are living in the CSCs, being calm, surrendered, centered, connected, and complete, the better it is for everyone. This week, we are talking about doubt, and Tuesday's CSC is being surrendered, so we thought we'd talk about doubt and God's character.
Yeah, and there's so many places in the Bible where God says, ask and you will receive, something like that. And this verse we've been reading in James definitely talks about that. And part of the asking, though, is God going to answer this question favorably? Is it worth surrendering? Because I don't want to get let down, or I don't want a bad answer either, or I don't want God to say no. Anyway. Right.
Or I just don't even believe that he cares enough to answer.
Yeah, does he even listen to the question?
Right. So James 1:5-8 is what we've been focusing on this week. It says, if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. But when he asks, he must believe and not doubt, because he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That man should not think he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all he does.
Yeah, and yesterday we talked about that, getting tossed about by the waves and the wind. But yeah, today this idea of, do we really believe that God will answer us favorably? I love that phrase.
That he gives generously to all without finding fault.
Yeah.
To all who ask.
And that's the thing, the asking. I feel like that's been such a big thing for me and for us in our life. Kind of at a place when we were younger of well, why isn't God doing this or why isn't God doing that? And then realizing we may not have been asking, and then starting to ask and hearing some answers, and God actually giving to us. And it's wow, that's how that works.
Yeah, it is amazing. And I love the without finding fault. I mean, that just, maybe it's because of my upbringing, but I love the fact that when we ask God for something, he's not like, you dummy, why can't you provide for yourself? Or why do you need wisdom in this? He, like it says in, I think it's Psalm 103, where it talks about that he knows who we are. He has compassion on us. He knows that we're dust. So he doesn't expect more out of us than we are capable of.
Yeah, and he's not my response to your question is, here's a list of reasons why I shouldn't answer.
Right, yeah.
Why you're not worthy.
That, I don't know, it's just so mind-boggling to me that he gives generously,
Yeah, well, and you touched on the hall of faith yesterday and not finding fault. Even in the Old Testament, before the cross, we see God's mercy and God not finding fault. I mean, there is times where God does find fault and he deals out his judgment, but there are more times, because the wages of sin is death, where we see him withholding that and blessing instead.
Right.
But because of people's interaction with him. I mean, I guess it does say God does send rain on the righteous and the unjust. Right. He called Abraham, and if Abraham would have said, no, forget about it, he's not going to use Abraham to make a nation. He would have called somebody else. So I guess then the question in our mind could be, well, if there is something I feel like I need or I want to know more about, if it's regarding wisdom or any other kind of resource, why haven't I asked God for this? If that might be a good question to ask yourself.
Well, and I think it's pretty easy, to pull those things back to God's character, to say, I don't believe that he takes care of me, or I don't believe that this is significant enough for him to care about. Or one of the examples I had, back before I became a Christian, I believed in God, but I really did not trust him, did not like him.
Yeah.
Hated him, was just you are a horrible, horrible God. Why would anyone want to serve you? because you put people through suffering. And because of the way that I saw God, I had no desire to have a relationship with him or to be in a position where I was dependent on him for anything, because I felt like he would just let me down.
I think
in a spectacular way.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people feel the same way, where maybe they're like, well, it seems foolish to say there's no God, but I'm not really interested in knowing God.
Right, exactly.
And because of this bad idea of who he is.
Right. And I think, like that verse says that if we ask, like, you're not going to ask a God that you don't trust. Mm-hmm. And you're not going to ask a God who you think won't give you anything good. That's been such a game changer for me. Later in the same chapter in James, it talks about how, it starts in verse 16. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. And that idea that everything that's good and perfect is like individualized. So everything that's good and individualized to me, that came from God. It didn't come from anybody else.
Yeah.
Yes, maybe say that you got me this amazing birthday present and I'm like, oh, thanks, honey. That's great. Which you did. Good job. But I could look at that and say, well, that's a gift from Evan, and I'm just going to be thankful to him. But I also have to look at it and say, well, God brought Evan into my life, and so ultimately that is a gift from him.
Right.
So I don't know. It's just such a mind shift to be like, God, the good things are from God, not the things that are negative long term. I think sometimes short term, just like, anybody that's training for something, like if you're training for a race or,
studying for a test.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. Like the training itself feels pretty bad in the short term. But then in the long term, it is definitely worth it. And I think in the short term, when we look at a lot of these things, it feels bad. But because we don't have God's perspective, we can't see how he's using it long term. And I'm not trying to say that there isn't suffering, because there is. Like, there are awful things that happen.
And it seems random because we don't have, this omnipresent sort of perspective on things.
Omniscient?
Yes.
Yeah, because we don't necessarily know. And God never ordains sin. That's one of those pet peeves of mine, when people are like, well, God ordained that, this person would do this horrible sin against me. Like, he ordained that I would be abused, or ordained that you would be abused. Like that, no. Like, God gives us free will. He works those things out. And if we surrender those things to him, he absolutely can work them out for good in our lives in ways that we cannot see or imagine right now. But it doesn't mean they're not bad.
I think another way that trusting God's perspective on things comes in very handy, and this whole idea of without finding fault, is when we go on the journey of self-discovery, or the Peter Cesar, I think he calls it the journey of self-discovery. It's where we talk about all the time, kind of doing self-examination and looking in ourselves. And if we know God's not condemning us and we're asking for wisdom, when you're sharing about not trusting God, believing that he was there but not trusting that he was necessarily good or something. If we're understanding that, and if we're understanding that there's no shame and condemnation there, we can, I think, find the courage to look inside and then start laying that stuff before God. The sin we find there, the darkness that we find there, the areas that we know we need to grow. And it's safe then, because he's saying if anybody desires wisdom, and we need wisdom to look at ourselves and to understand the world around us. We're not going to be able to do that without shame unless we understand who God is, and that he's not looking for a fight or a reason to condemn. He's looking for a reason to connect with us. Right.
Yeah, that he doesn't shame us. It makes it possible for us not to shame ourselves. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
I think, too, one of the areas where wisdom comes into play is knowing who God is. Because if we can't trust him, if we doubt him because we don't know who he is, We need wisdom to see where those doubts are and to see who he truly is. So that's another area where we can just say, okay, Lord, like we were talking about yesterday with that father who brings his demon-possessed son to Jesus and then says, I do believe, help my unbelief. We can do the same thing in the area of who is God. We can say, I want to believe who you say that you are, and look at scripture to see what that is. And then say, give me wisdom. Show me where my beliefs don't match up with who you are and help my unbelief. Mm-hmm. As always, pick whether today is going to be awesome or not, whether you're going to strengthen those neural pathways to look for the good or to look for the negative things in your life. Because whatever you look for is usually what you find and what you find more of.
Yeah, and what you look for is based on your beliefs about the world and about God, like we were talking about today. If you're looking for God to answer your prayer and to not condemn you, that's the right thing to be looking for.
Yes. We love you guys, and we are praying for you. Thanks to everybody that's been listening to the show and sharing the show. We really appreciate it. If you did find this episode helpful, please do share it. And come back tomorrow, and we are going to continue our discussion on doubts and talk about maturity versus ease. All right, you guys, have an awesome Tuesday.